What is the impact of President Trump's battle against USAID? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the freedom philosophy. Richard, my co-host Richard Eveling from the Citadel, professor of economics. Richard, good to see you again for another
It's good to
round.
see you and to be with our viewers and listeners as always.
Yeah, lots of things going on, Richard. Of course, never a dull moment with Donald Trump as president. Um, but I thought we'd start talking about USAID and foreign aid in general. People think, oh, you guys, all you do is criticize President Trump. That's all you do. Well, here we're going to prove him wrong. At least I am. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's fantastic what they're doing with USAID. He and Elon Musk. They're threatening to shut down the thing. I wish they wouldn't threaten. I wish they'd shut it down. But certainly they're creating chaos. They're upsetting the status. They're upsetting all kinds of people in Washington that believe in these bureaucracies, that believe these bureaucracies are perpetual, that they should never be abolished. They're bringing up every single argument in their arsenal to keep this thing in existence. Uh, but Trump seems and Musk, they both seem to be hanging tough. They laid off some of the directors or the heads when they wouldn't let Musk into the front door. This okay, you're fired. And now they're talking about absorbing USAID into the State Department and just abolishing it, take over its functions. And then there's the larger issue of foreign aid that I may have this wrong, but it appears that he froze all foreign aid. I'm not really sure about that part. I know that he froze a lot of foreign aid programs, which is great. I mean, you and I have been opposing foreign aid for 36 years. We've been doing here at FFF. And so let me just start out with USAID and give you my perspective on that. They're bringing up the standard arguments they do with these foreign aid programs that, oh, this is designed to help the poor, needy, and disadvantaged, and then they're listing all the people that are going to be dying and suffering if USAID no longer is able to give out grants. Well, this is all part of the ruse. I mean, you put some people out there on the foreign dole, and then as soon as somebody threatens to abolish the agency, oh no, look at all the poor people that are going to be dying in the streets of doing this. And the idea is that they're trying to show that America's a good, caring, compassionate nation, and that Trump is going to hurt America because he's going to prove that we're just selfish and self-centered and uh, greedy profiteers. And well, it's like you and I have said for 36 years. There is no care and compassion in a foreign aid program anymore there is in a welfare state program. These are programs that are based on the coercive apparatus of the state. The government operated through the IRS, which is one of the most brutal, terrifying, uh, harsh agencies in U.S. history, goes out and forcibly collects money through the income tax, gathers it up, and then goes out and distributes the money to the welfare state bureaucracies, USAID, which then give it to the poor, and everybody's considered to be good, caring, and compassionate. Oh, well, we're such a good country. Oh, American taxpayers are such wonderful people. This is pure bull. There is no care and compassion in coercion. Genuine care and compassion comes from the willing heart of the individual, where people are donating portions of their own money to help out the poor around the world in this country on a purely voluntary basis. And what they've done with these programs is create this mindset that you need government to do this. You cannot trust people in the private sector to do it voluntarily, so you have to force them to do it. The other point I want to make up, another point is they say, oh, well, this is just a very small part of the, no, this is a very small part of the budget. It's not going to really make that much of a difference. It's like 1%. So there's no point in abolishing it for fiscal reasons. Well, you could say that for all the other hundreds of 1% programs. But if you add up all these 1%, all of a sudden you're talking about serious money. And if you talk about ending the big ones like Social Security and Medicare and the military and the CIA, they go ballistic there too and say, oh no, people be dying in the streets. So, under their rationale, Richard, nothing ever gets cut. Not the big ones, not the tiny ones. But the final thing I want to point is that the USAID has long been a front for the CIA. This is how the CIA does a lot of its nasty, dirty, dark side work, but it covers itself by in the aura of this good, caring, compassionate agency, so that everybody looks at, oh, look at all the poor we're helping. That disguises the CIA's dark side deeds within this cloak of doing good and compassionate things. I mean, that's pretty evil when you're using good to disguise evil. And a good example of this was many years ago, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, the USAID was implementing this Twitter-like program in Cuba. It was called Zunzaneo, and they were doing surreptitiously, but they were saying, oh, well, this is to get freedom of speech in Cuba and stuff. Well, it was all a ruse designed to foment dissent in Cuba to rile people up to bring about a revolution that would bring regime change. Well, that's not what USAID is supposed to be all about. And so it was pretty clear, I shouldn't say pretty clear, very clear that this was a CIA operation operating under the cover of USAID. So for me, the sooner you get rid of this evil, corrupt agency, the better. And the same with foreign aid. The sooner we get rid of foreign aid, which is just a form of bribery, it's just bribing foreign officials, put them on the dole so that you can then threaten them. If you don't do what we want you to do, we're going to take away your dole. I say abolish the whole thing. What do you say?
Well, I think that, a part of the arguments that have been bandied about in the last few days about this is that uh, these grants and other forms of money go to these other organizations around the world that are helping to vaccinate people against smallpox or fighting AIDS and so on. And of course, these other organizations are called NGOs, non-governmental organization, but they're not non-governmental organizations because so many of them would not be able to do what they do if they weren't on the dole from this largesse from the US government. And also Europeans governments give this money as well. It's not just the US that does this. But the point is, these are just arms of these have become subservient arms of the government that would not be able to do their purposes or the purposes that the US government would like them to do if the American taxpayer money was not there. So basically, this is American subsidized non-governmental organizations who live off the dole to have their own agendas, as well as to serve certain U.S. interests. So the non-governmental organizations are supposed to create the impression this is the private sector. These are people who care, wealthy people, modest financial people who they give money, or like Doctors Without Borders, they give some time out in the field in a country suffering from poverty. So this idea of the civil society, the non-governmental society, but it's not. These are just organizations that use taxpayer money for their own agendas. Now, the agenda might be sincerely, let's vaccinate kids from smallpox, but then you have these political agendas that have ideological content of one type or another. And if you're a conservative, you're not going to like some of this content. If you're a lefty, you're not going to like some of that content. But the point is, they're just using U.S. taxpayer dollars for their own agendas rather than collect voluntary contributions to pursue their purposes and goals. And this is just a way to get other people's money to serve your purposes that you can't get through voluntary contributions. And I'll go even further on that. I believe that these NGOs, to the extent that their motive is to help the poor, help vaccinate kids from polio, blah, 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 blah. I know from having been the president of a nonprofit myself for 5 years, the Foundation for Economic Education, that when you can't rely upon a guaranteed dollar from the government, you then really are dependent upon the voluntary and willing giving of a private donor. And you have to demonstrate to that donor it's a worthy cause. You're going to cost efficiently use the money that they choose to donate to you. And then you have to show the results because you want them to contribute next year and hopefully more than they did the previous year, and to, through word of mouth, recommend other prospective charitable donors. And then you're just competing in an open market for good causes. And you have to demonstrate that the dollars are worth it, as opposed to them either spending their money on themselves or some other charitable cause. You, like all forms of competition, it makes the organization or the individual do better in the because they're in rivalry with other organizations. The outcome is it serves those who you say you want to serve, and you're doing it in the most cost efficient way when there's open competition of private sector charities. But these NGOs just live off government dollars, a large part the US, but also the European Union. And therefore, it's just a con game for their ideological purposes where they don't have to really prove to people that what they're doing is worth a contribution. The other thing that I'll just say about this um, is that this is another instance. It's not just the organizations out there who get these grants and funds. It's the bureaucracy itself. They have an institutional life of their own. Their jobs, their promotions, their senses of self-identity, all are dependent upon their positions in the bureaucratic structure. The power, the influence, the promotions, the playing, being more of a player in setting the policies and directing the policies, all at taxpayers' expense. And therefore, the bureaucracy has no purpose other than to perpetuate itself. In the private sector, you make money by solving people's problems. A shirt that resists stains and doesn't wrinkle so you don't have to iron it, a tastier breakfast cereal, a pair of shoes that fits better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You make money by solving people's problems and making people's lives better. But in the bureaucracy, there is no incentive to solve the problem, because then the head of this agency would have to go before the appropriate congressional committee responsible for its funding the next fiscal year and say, Mr. Congressman, Mr. Senator, you know the problem for which you originally set us up and were going to fund us? Mission accomplished, problem solved. So please, over the next 2 years, would you reduce our budget until it's zero? Because you don't need us anymore. They never have a motive to solve the problem. They have a motive of saying, we need more money because the problem you set us up for is worse than we had thought. And we need more staff, and we need more money, and we need more programs. And on top of that, the reason you set us up, we realize that there are other problems that just perfectly fit our responsibility, and we need funding for those additional problems. So the problem that their mindset is to always find new problems and never solve the problems that they were set up for, and just keep getting government taxpayers' money, as opposed to either a for-profit company. Let me show you the nicer pair of shoes, the better flat screen TV with improved pixels that would be advantageous for you to buy from me. Or we're fighting for a good charitable cause. Let me show you why it's worth supporting and how we're going to efficiently and goal-oriented spend your dollar so that you'll have no regrets of having given the money, and maybe you'll give again next year. That's the private sector. The bureaucracy, you can't refuse to pay. It's compulsory taxation. And they just live off this. That's their trough, their rice bowl, whatever metaphor you want to use. And they just want to have the rice bowl and the trough bigger and better so they have higher incomes, more promotions, and more power over our lives. And so if Donald Trump, and this would apply to any president, was able to abolish or radically reduce as a first step to abolition these organizations and branches of government, I would say great. But I will bet you that at the end of the day, USAID will not go away. And the reason I say this is that if you listen to the Trump people or their sycophants at Fox News, what you find is they say, yes, what is this USAID money going to educate people in Nepal about atheism, or a gender lesbian cartoon book in Cambodia. Oh, madness, madness. But of course, we need to have this agency, whether it's on its own or part of the State Department, to be there to help fund polio vaccines, and this and that and the other. So in fact, what it is like around the edges that seem bizarro to a lot of people who support Trump and like, why is my money going for this weirdo cause or purpose? But of course, there's the central ones. And the answer to that is, yes, there are good causes. Nobody wants to see little kids suffer from polio or smallpox or any of these terrible diseases. I mean, who wants to see a kid paralyzed? But it is not the responsibility of government. It's the responsibility of people who have a generous and charitable sense for their fellow men, and do so through private avenues that will more effectively solve the problems for which the charity giver wants to see solved.
Yeah, and oftentimes they'll crowd out private sector activities. And then they'll say, oh, no, the private sector doesn't do it. Where are they? Where are they? We are the only ones that would be doing it. Well, yeah, because the private sector is not going to get involved if the government's over there dominating that
Right.
sector of the market. And then they also destroy faith in freedom, free markets, and voluntary charity. That people get to the point where they say, "Oh no, Jacob, you can't rely on voluntary people. People are evil. Only bureaucrats are good." And they never explain how it is that the small, selfish, saintly minority in society somehow gets elected or appointed to these federal offices. I mean, if your society is predominantly selfish, evil, uncaring, why would they put this tiny minority of saints in these positions? But it's where they destroy people's faith. And the other thing, Richard, is they spend all the money at the end of the year, because if they don't get spend all the money, they don't get it the following year. So there's where your waste comes in. If they've been allocated, let's say $1 million in some small country and they've spent only 750, I guarantee you in December, they're figuring out ways to get rid of that money because they don't get it renewed, if unless they spend it all. So it's just the whole system's just corrupt. It's just absolutely corrupt. We should keep in mind that our American ancestors didn't have this system. There was no foreign aid for over 100 years. They didn't believe in this system. You made no income tax, no welfare state, no foreign aid. You made your money and you gave it away if you wanted to. For those that say, "Oh no, the rich would never help out the poor," one man in the late 1800s gave away $500 billion. And that was money back in that time, 500 billion. Gave it away, and not because of an income tax deduction, but because there was no income tax, because he cared. And that's what we need to restore in this country.
Yeah, I would just say is that for those who believe that, how could the private sector do this? I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners have heard of the famous French social philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote that famous book, Democracy in America, after visiting the United States for several months in the 1830s. And it's a two-volume work that he published, originally in French, obviously it's in English as well. And in volume two, he has a section which he talks about the charitable associations and organizations in the United States. And he says that one of the things that was most amazing, and he thinks Europeans should listen the most to, pay attention the most to, is that the country is a wash, he's saying. This is like in the mid 1830s. With associations and organizations and charities that when anybody sees a worthwhile cause, whether it be religious, educational, helping those who are far less well off than oneself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, people immediately form associations, organizations, clubs, and combine their resources and their ideas to solve these problems, to proselytize, to educate, to assist those who are less well off. And he says it's amazing that the range and the width and the presence of all of these voluntary charities through people just coming together everywhere. And in Great Britain, beginning in the early 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, there were these things called the friendly societies. And these were really non-governmental organizations that were first set up to help people for insurance policies and mutual assurance, death benefits. The breadwinner dies, who's going to bury him? But then that branched out into health insurance that the friendly societies are offering for their members, for retirement plans, little mutual savings banks, so people could modestly put some money aside to buy a home, a house somewhere. Uh, and they would rotate the personnel in the organization so people could learn senses of responsibility in an organization, uh, to be more effective in these things. And by the end of the 19th century, these friendly societies of healthcare, retirement, housing, and so on, the studies show that two-thirds to three-quarters of the entire British population were participating in these mutual aid friendly societies. And that the largest number were not the upper middle class. You say, well, they could afford, the insurance premiums, but to belong to these. No, their books show that the largest proportion were in the particularly low income brackets of, quote, the British working class, because they were the ones who were most aware of the fact that if misfortune fell upon them, they needed to have arranged something so their families could be okay, or they could have some type of a policy while they were, overcoming an illness to go back to work. But what destroyed these was Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. Because around 1910, Lloyd George's government in Britain, of which Winston Churchill was a member already, they copied the imperial German welfare state. They started introducing national health care and things. And they ended up, through giving it away for free through tax dollars, crowding out those friendly societies. So that by the 1920s, the friendly societies were virtually gone. Because how
Wow.
do you compete with free when it's tax dollars, as opposed to, people voluntarily paying a premium for these mutual assurance arrangements? So yes, the private sector has demonstrated, both in Britain and the United States, the effectiveness. And I'll just make one other observation as an historical example. In the 19th century, there was a huge emergence of charitable organizations. Catholics, Protestants, they would have hospitals, they would set up orphanages that would accept virtually anyone. Obviously, priorities if you're a Catholic orphan or a Protestant orphan, but open to all of these things. Organizations to help people who fell upon hard times learn a new skill to be able to be employable again. The Salvation Army, among these, Cadbury chocolate, the famous British chocolate. The Cadbury brothers set up a whole series of these charitable organizations. So the fact is that the wealthy and just the ordinary people who are part of churches or community organizations always helping themselves and their fellow man through these charitable efforts without a dime of government money and before anything at all of the idea of the charitable deduction on your income tax. This was sent out of a sense of benevolence towards your fellow man and to find efficacious ways to make your community better by helping others who you felt a calling to assist.
Yeah, that's a nice real life demonstration of the point I was making about having faith and restoring faith in the free market. I mean, there you set it forth. You set forth exactly what happens when people are free with de Tocqueville's observations. Okay, Richard, we ought to at least devote a few minutes to Trump's tariffs, his latest round of tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and China. I mean, if you got whiplash the last day on what's happening, it would be understandable. So Trump starts out with a 25% tariff, doesn't go to Congress, does it all on his own. It's like a decree law, and it's a tax on the American people. I'm not sure he understands that yet, that he has the power, the omnipotent power, to raise taxes on the American people without going to Congress. He has the power of the purse here, the power of taxation. So he says, I'm going to unilaterally raise sales taxes on the American people. That's what tariffs are. They're sales taxes on imported goods. And he's going to do a 25%, which is enormous, on the Mexican people, the same thing on the Canadians, and then 10% on China. I'm not really sure why he's giving China preferential treatment here. Uh, and I think it's also worth pointing out that these these two nations, Mexico and Canada, are not opponents, rivals, enemies, official, you know, empire enemies, the U.S. empire. These are supposedly allies, friends. But he wants, let me just stick with Mexico for a minute. He wants Mexico to enforce his immigration controls. I mean, it's clear that what he's saying is, I can't enforce the system. For 4 years, he kept saying, Biden's standing down. He's not enforcing the system. That's the problem. Well, no, that wasn't the problem. The problem was the system wasn't working. And he's proving that because as soon as he gets into office, he's essentially saying, well, yeah, Jacob, you're right. I can't enforce the system. I need Mexico's help here. So Mexico agreed to send 10,000 troops to the border with the guns pointing inward. You see, our guns are pointing toward Mexico. We're sending troops down there too. This is a total militarized zone, just like, well, the Berlin Wall is a good example. People have said to me, Jacob, it's not really a Berlin Wall because we're trying to keep people out. Well, does that make it, if West Germany had said, we got to protect our borders, and any East German that crosses the wall and tries to get in, we're going to shoot him, that would be okay? Well, he's put Mexico in the East German position now. They've got the troops there that are pointing their guns not toward the United States, but toward their own people and saying, if you try to cross this in violation of U.S. immigration law, we will stop you one way or the other. Well, this is shameful and despicable on the part of Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president. I think she would have been better off just saying, put your stupid tariffs on and not retaliate. That was the other thing about it. The Chinese have learned. They've been reading our stuff here, Richard, I think at FFF, because for years we've been saying the worst thing a country can do is retaliate. That's like they shoot you in the foot. And so you say, well, let me shoot myself in the other foot. Just wait till the country gets sanity and lowers its tariffs again. And the final point I want to make is, did you ever think you'd see the day that the party of Ronald Reagan would be the party of economic protectionism? I mean, this is incredible, Richard. Republicans used to be free traders, and now it's the exact opposite. They are the ardent protectionists. What do you think?
Well, let's remind ourselves, why do people trade? At the end of the day, people trade for a handful of reasons. One is, if I don't buy something from Jacob Hornberger, I don't have it because he has either the knowledge, skills, or the resources to produce something that I don't have the capacity to do. So I either buy it from Jacob Hornberger or I do without it. Or I could make it myself, but Jacob Hornberger can either make it better in terms of features, qualities, and characteristics, or at a lower cost in terms of my time, my labor, the resource consumed in it. And therefore, I could either get it, but a poorer quality and at a higher expense to do it myself, or I can buy it from Jacob Hornberger. Now, variations of those two are the reasons why people trade. So there is no situation where if I win, he loses. If he loses, I win. The fact is, trade is mutual because why will Jacob Hornberger trade with me? Because either I can make something that he can't, and therefore he benefits from buying it from me, or I can reciprocally make something that he can't as well or as the same lower cost. So it's better for him to produce what he's best at and then to trade for what he wants, that thing that I can make better than him or best, less expensively than him. That variations on that thing is why we all trade. So this idea that somehow Canada or Mexico is taking advantage of us is absolutely nonsense. Now, the reason why Trump says this, oh, they're taking advantage of us, they're stealing from us, is the most crude mercantilist conception of trade. If we buy more from them than they buy from us, we are a net owing them. So, and somehow they must be gaining more from us than we gain from them, and therefore we're losers. We're defeated. We're made worse off. And that's not the case. First of all, you can't look at these balances in terms of one country and another country, any more than one person and another. For example, I have a positive balance of trade with my Citadel students. Why do I say that? They buy more from me through their tuition than I buy with the money I earn from their parents who are making various products in the marketplace. right? They buy my teaching services through the salary I receive at the Citadel. So I make X number of dollars. But do I spend my dollars in some reciprocal amount to Joe's parent who makes shoes, or Sally's father who's a lawyer in terms of legal services? No, I don't buy anything virtually from any of the people that I'm selling my labors or service to. So they have a balance of trade deficit with me, and I have a balance of trade surplus with them. But now I go to the supermarket and I buy my weekly or monthly groceries, and I buy all of their stuff. But with the income they earn from selling me a cartload of food, do they reciprocally buy economics lectures from me? If I had to directly sell my economic lectures to the grocery store manager to get the cartload of food that I want, I'd starve to death. Because I know it's hard to believe, Jacob, but there are people out in the world who really don't want to pay to hear me talk about economics. I mean, it's a madness, but there's always a weirdo who doesn't see the wisdom of learning economics. But so I have a balance of trade deficit with the supermarket, and they have a balance of trade surplus. So you can't look at individual trading partners. What you have to look is your entire balance sheet. I have balance of trade deficits with some trading partners, and a balance of trade surpluses with others. But on net, they have to balance. Why? Because at the end of the day, I can't spend more from than the income I have earned by selling others what I have for sale. And they can't buy more from me than at the end of the day they have earned from selling whatever they are to others. So the point is, at the end of the day, there can be individual balance of trade deficits. I with the supermarket, balance of trade surplus with my students or their parents through their tuition. But at the end of the day, they have to balance out. You have an income constraint. And if you have a deficit here, you have a surplus there, it has to balance out because the constraint is the amount of money you have to spend in any direction. And that applies to countries too. There are countries who have balance of trade surpluses with, balance of trade deficits with. And I'll just make one other thing without being too wonky here. So let's suppose that Japan sells us more than sells us, we buy more from Japan than they buy from us. Okay, what do they do with their dollars after buying our goods, finished goods? Well, what are they going to play with the dollars, put it up as wallpaper? No. Well, they only have several choices. They could directly invest in the US economy. That's when, like, Volvo or Honda decides to build a factory in America, and they spend dollars that they clearly earned in the past by selling us automobiles of buying or renting the land, hiring an American construction company to build the factory, hiring someone to make the machines that they use to make their automobiles in the United States, and hire mostly American workers. So direct investment are just dollars spent back in the American economy anyway. Or they indirectly invest. That's just you and me earning income, and we don't spend it all. We save part of it. But we don't want to start a business or partner in a business directly. We're not interested. We don't have the expertise. So what we do, we indirectly invest. That's taking our savings into a financial institution, a bank, and then your savings and my savings are pooled and funneled together and lent to people who want those dollars for investing. And if the Japanese or the Indians or the French do that, they're just adding to our savings pool and making more savings available for American investors to use. And then finally, what else could these Japanese earners of dollars do? Well, they don't want to buy American goods. They don't want to directly invest in the American economy. They don't want to indirectly invest by putting some of the dollars they earned in a savings account to earn interest in America. But they want to buy goods in Europe. And so they sell their dollars in the foreign exchange market for euros. But why will someone sell that Japanese earner of dollars euros? Because they want dollars. And what do they want the dollars for? They want to buy our products, or they want to directly invest in our economy, or put our that money in an American financial institution to collect interest income, just like you and I put money in a bank. And at the end of the day, the dollars earned are equal to the dollars expended in some way or another. The balance of payments balances. And the problem with Donald Trump, he doesn't understand this. He may have gotten his business degree from Carnegie Mellon, but clearly he missed some econ classes that he was supposed to be attending when these fundamental ideas of division of labor and trade were being talked about. So he needs a remedial course. And I'm happy, and I am sure that Sid will be glad to allow him to do it free of charge, to sit into my econ lectures and learn the truth about how trade works. But it's just madness. And I know we're getting short of time, but just let me make one reinforcement of an observation you said, is that you're saying the Chinese are wise if they just make a complaint to the World Trade Organization, but don't put on reciprocal tariffs. There was a British economist named Henry MacLeod in the late 19th century, and he was a unilateral free trader. And in one of his books talking about this, he says, let us suppose a country imposes tariff barriers against our goods. In a sense, that's slapping our face because now they hurt us through that trade barrier. But what is trade retaliation? That's saying, oh, yeah, well, we're going to impose reciprocal barriers against you. And that's equivalent to hitting yourself on the other cheek even harder, because then you're denying yourself things that you could have bought from those countries, regardless of the trade policies that other country follows. So you just double the harm that the other country may be trying to do you with the trade barriers. So the Chinese would be hurting themselves more by retaliating than just biting the bullet and accepting the fact that Trump is an idiot and imposing tariffs on some of their exports. So yes, the best policy that Canada and Mexico should follow is just to say, okay, fine. Our exporters are going to lose sales, but we would only make the situation worse for our own consumers and producers if we retaliate with reciprocal trade barriers. So we'll just wait until you realize that you've made a bad decision, because we can only make it worse by doing the same to you that you've just done to us.
Yeah. Well, to reinforce the point you were making about trade deficits and trade imbalances between nations, which is a ridiculous concept. I wish it had never been invented. And you can see that between the states. I mean, who paces the floor worrying about the trade deficit between Virginia and Florida? Nobody does. Nobody even reports the figures. I don't even know who's got the favorable balance. Nobody cares. The same principle applies internationally. And here domestically, you've got people. It's an intricate system where you're buying something in Florida, but you're buying another part over there in California and other parts in Texas. They all come together. And it's really a complex, intricate system that the market brings into existence. That's what's been going on with these countries, Richard. Now, I'm not saying they've had total free trade. We know that NAFTA was managed trade, but the trade barriers were relatively lower, a lot lower than they are today. And so you've got these intricate interrelationships taking place between with these manufacturers. Some of them are working in Mexico. They got outlets there doing things. They're buying parts from Canada. All this thing is very complex. Trump comes in, he's like a bull in a china shop, and he's just tearing these things apart. He's just disrupting everything. He's like an agent of chaos. And I'll wrap this up by saying my hunch is that the reason he cratered so quickly on this thing, I mean, he's just delayed it a month for them to negotiate. But, the biggest thing for him is the stock market. He's always watching that stock market. And the stock market took a huge hit this morning after he announced these tariffs. And so did the stock markets in Europe. And I think that's what scared him to death. And that's why he cratered and decided to extend these things for a month.
Yeah, just make one other point here before we close. He's saying who cares about the trade balances between California and West Virginia and New York versus Arizona? But think of what Trump has said himself to Trudeau shortly after he became president. Oh, why don't you become the 51st state? Then there'll be no problem. Well, suddenly, if we annex Canada, then there's no trade balance problem, right? There's no difficulties. So if that's true, what the hell is the difference with this political line on a map that says you're country A and we're country B, and somehow that makes a difference that it would go away if the line disappears. The goods and services still going between Canada and the United States. Only Canada is now what, a state of the United States, like Montana or Oklahoma. Uh, but it doesn't change the fact. So taking away this imaginary line ends the trade problems. That just shows that the imaginary line doesn't matter.
That's brilliant, Richard. That's absolutely brilliant. But the line doesn't disappear. the line stays there.
Yes,
Instead of being an international line, it's a state line.
correct.
That's
And by the
brilliant.
way, that is not an endorsement on my part of Canada becoming the party of the United States, because they're all a bunch of commie pinkos up there who love socialized medicine and in some ways an even worse welfare state than we have. I don't want those damn Canadians voting for senators and members of the House in the United States and making our interventionist welfare state worse than it already is. So keep those damn guys in their own country.
Yeah, well, not only that, but it wouldn't be just one state. Possibly they could divide up into 10 states. And
Their provincial states provinces would be states. What,
yeah,
another 8 or 10 of them then?
yeah. See, I'm a native Texan, and I remember what some guy in Alaska said to me once. He says, "You people in Texas better be nice to us because we may divide into two and make Texas the third largest state of the union." uh, anyway, Richard, greatly enjoyed the visit as always. Look forward to talking to you next week. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your support of FFF. And Richard, I'll see you next week.
Until next time.